Right, hello, Year 12. Hope you're all right. We're moving on to a new topic, which is we've done religious experiences, and you should be doing teleological and cosmological arguments with Mr. Ward. I'm going to look at the ontological argument. Now, this is an argument that we did not look at in GCSE, and it's quite a different kind of argument for the existence of God. And maybe one of the more complicated ones. I don't know. We'll have to see as we go through these lessons. It's certainly one of the strangest ones. So I think when people first come across it, they're often a bit intimidated by it because it's quite a strange argument. And what usually happens is that people think that the argument is wrong. They disagree with it, but they don't know why they disagree with it. They can't quite put it into words why they disagree with it. And that's you're probably there's nothing wrong with thinking that, because actually when we get to the end of it, you'll see that there's a criticism of this argument that you probably agreed with all along. It's just you didn't know how to put it into words. So what I'm going to say is, don't be worried if at first the argument seems really strange and you kind of don't get it, and you think, well, this is just stupid. That's fine. I think on the whole, whether or not you think there are good arguments for the existence of God, most people end up thinking this is not a good argument, but I think it is at least a very interesting argument, and the way it works is interesting. So today I'm going to explain the basic argument, the basic ontological argument, which comes from this guy. The guy on the screen right now is called St. Anselm, Christian philosopher. We're going to look at what the argument is, and we're not going to look at any criticisms yet, because we're going to build up through the lesson. So we're going to look at today just at the argument, and we're going to do a lot on terminology that you need to understand this argument. And then next video we'll look at how it can be criticized. Then after that we'll look at how supporters of the argument respond to those criticisms. Then we will look at a different form of the argument. It's actually quite similar, just in different words, which comes from Descartes, famous philosopher. And then we'll look at the criticism of Descartes from Kant, and you can actually use Kant's criticism to apply to Anselm's argument too, but that's just the order we do it in. And as you'll see, Kant's criticism is fairly powerful. So, like I say, today we're going to go through the basic argument and some terminology, some key terminology. Some of this terminology you'll know already, especially from doing ethics and doing Kant in ethics. The terminology comes up there. Some might be new. We'll have to see. What do I want you to do with this lesson? Well, I'm going to put two things on the Teams with the video, so there'll be a copy of these slides, and also I'll put a separate handout which has all the terminology on. You might just want that handout because it's kind of much presented in a more clear way for reading, whereas here on the slides it's presented for me to present on this video. So that'll all be there. So just print those off if you can, and add any annotations that you want. I'm also going to ask you to kind of write your own summary of the argument at the end. You'll see why I want you to do that, because I just want you to be as clear as you can about how this argument works. Okay, let's jump into the terminology. So these are the key terms that you need to understand before we look at the argument. So a priori and a posteriori, these are the red and blues are opposites basically. Analytic and synthetic, you should know those two from Kant. And then inductive and deductive, I don't know if we talked about those at all, but it is important to understand the difference between the two. And then we're going to look at one term that's hasn't got an opposite there. It's reductio ad absurdum, a Latin term which describes the kind of argument that Anselm's argument is. So let's go to a priori and a posteriori. You should know this stuff, but let's just go over it again. So these are two kinds of knowledge. So a posteriori knowledge is knowledge which depends on, typo, can't believe that. Depends on, not of, depends on sense experience. So for example, if you were to say it's raining today, it's actually not raining today, but imagine it was. If you were to say it's raining today, then that knowledge would be a posteriori, because you couldn't know it without looking using your senses. You'd have to look outside to see if it's raining, and if it was, you could say that statement was true. So that is a posteriori knowledge. A priori knowledge is knowledge which is not based on sense experience. This kind of knowledge is worked out using reason. So, for example, say I said I've got here's a triangle. It's got three sides. Now you wouldn't have to look at the triangle to know that it had three sides. That's a priori true. It's true a priori. That means it's true before you look at any evidence. So that's something that can be worked out using sense knowledge. You wouldn't need to look at a triangle to know it's got three sides because it's part of the definition of a triangle that it does have three sides. A priori and a posteriori. Analytic and synthetic, these ideas are kind of linked to a priori and a posteriori, or at least, well, it's complicated by Kant, but there's a basic link between them. So an analytic statement is a statement that's true by definition, e.g. all bachelors are unmarried men, or because a part of the definition of a bachelor is that they're unmarried, or all triangles have three sides, or all circles are round. So analytic statements are true by definition. Synthetic statements are any statements that are not true by definition. For example, it is raining today, or that man's got blue trainers on, or something like that. Anything like that, which you couldn't tell just from the statement whether it was true or false. You have to go for a posteriori knowledge to prove them. So analytic statements are linked to a priori knowledge usually, because if it's true by definition, then you can work out whether it's true through reason. Synthetic statements are linked to a posteriori knowledge because you need sense experience to know whether they're true or not. Now, Kant complicates things by saying that there is such a thing as a synthetic a priori. Synthetic a priori. So he complicates things there, but usually analytic links to a priori and synthetic to a posteriori. Okay. Next set of definitions. Inductive and deductive arguments. So these are different kinds of philosophical argument. So let's start with inductive. Inductive arguments are arguments which draw general conclusions based on particular examples. In these arguments, we base our theories about what is true on our previous experience. So here's an example. All cats you have observed purr. Therefore, every cat must purr. So you're using, say you'd seen 100 cats and all of them had purred, then you'd be like, well, therefore I think that the next cat I see, or all cats I'm going to see ever, are going to purr. So you're basing your conclusion on previous experience. Now, the thing about inductive arguments is they can never provide definitive proof of the truth of a conclusion. However, the more evidence there is to support the conclusion, the greater the likelihood that it's correct. So, if I'd only ever seen one cat that purred, that's not great evidence that all cats purr. If I'd seen 1 million cats and they all purred, that seems to be better evidence. But still, it could never be conclusive evidence, because you could have you could find a cat that doesn't purr in the future. So that's the problem with inductive arguments. Just because something's always been true in the past, that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be true in the future. Or just because it's true for like a huge number of examples, that doesn't mean it's going to be true for every example. Let's have a look at a couple of inductive arguments and just to get our head around it a little bit. Here's an inductive argument. The sun has come up every morning throughout the history of humanity. So, all our experiences of humanity is that the sun comes up every morning. Therefore, the sun will come up tomorrow. Now, it's a pretty good argument. I think the sun's likely to come up every day because of the experience of people in the past. But of course, it can't prove it conclusively, because perhaps tomorrow will be the day when the sun doesn't come up. And of course, there will be one day at the end of the world where the sun doesn't come up. So it's a inductive argument. It's pretty strong, but it can't be conclusive. Here's one that I always use to talk about inductive arguments, because I think it's interesting. All swans that we have seen are white, therefore all swans are white. Well, this is actually false. There are black swans, but there would have been a time, I'd guess, in this country, because all swans you see in this country are white, there would have been a time when people thought this was a pretty good argument. They'd be like, yeah, every swan we've seen is white, so therefore all swans are white. So this shows the weakness of inductive arguments. This probably would have looked true to someone living, 500 years ago, or whenever it was, before we knew that in other parts of the world you get black swans. But as soon as you see one black swan, you realise that this is not a true argument, that not all swans are white. So this is the weakness in inductive arguments. Just because something has always been the case in the past, it doesn't mean it necessarily will be that in the future. Here's an inductive argument, which is an argument for the existence of God. Everything that we can observe has a cause, therefore the universe must have a cause. That is basically the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Saying everything has a cause, therefore the universe has a cause, and that cause must be God. Now, again, so a lot of people think this is a pretty strong argument, but some people might say, well, hold on, just because everything we know of has a cause, why does that mean that doesn't necessarily mean everything ever must have a cause? It just means all the things we know of. And then there might be some things that don't have a cause. Perhaps the universe was never created and just goes back forever. Even that a person who agrees with the ontological argument, with the cosmological argument, would have to say that God didn't have a cause. Otherwise, you end up with an infinite regress of causes. So, again, that you can see the problems with inductive arguments. That doesn't mean inductive arguments are bad. It just means that they can't lead to complete certainty. So here's the positives and negatives. So what's good about them? Well, inductive arguments provide us with new knowledge. They take us from an observed thing to something that we can't observe. So that's why they're very popular, because you can say, well, I've observed this number of things, and therefore I'm drawing a conclusion about something that I can't observe. So I can't observe every day into the future, but I can use my knowledge of the past to say, well, I think that the sun's going to come up every day. So even if my knowledge isn't absolutely 100% sure, it might be the best way we have of finding out new things, or making new theories. However, obviously the difficulty is inductive arguments can only give us probable conclusions. We cannot know for certain whether the conclusion is correct. Okay, second type of argument, deductive arguments. These are arguments in which the conclusion follows logically from the premises. The premises are the first parts of the argument. The conclusion must be true if the premises of the argument are true and the structure of the argument is correct. So I'll take you through an example to show what I mean by premises and conclusion. So these are two premises. This is an argument with two premises and one conclusion. All cows are mammals. That's one premise, premise one. Premise two is Tabitha is a cow. And then my conclusion is, therefore, Tabitha is a mammal. Now, this is a deductive argument because we don't need, if those first two things are true, we don't need any evidence to get to the conclusion. If it's true that all cows are mammals, and it's true that Tabitha is a cow, then we know that Tabitha is a mammal. No more information, no observations are needed if the two premises are true. So to attack that argument, we'd either have to show that Tabitha wasn't a cow, or that all cows are not mammals. Let's look at some more. Squares have four sides. This piece of paper is a square, therefore this piece of paper has four sides. So look, so if I've got that piece of paper in front of me and I'm not showing it to you, and I say it's a square, and I tell you that all squares have four sides, you don't need any observations. You just need to know the two premises. Premise one, squares have four sides, and two, this piece of paper is a square. If they're true, then the conclusion naturally flows. Therefore, the paper has to have four sides. How about this one? All human beings are mortal. I am a human, therefore I am mortal. In other words, mortal means they will die one day. So again, as long as the first two are true, all humans are mortal, I am a human, that the conclusion must be true if the first two are true, because it logically follows. If all humans are mortal, and if I am a human, I must be mortal. Now, whether all humans are mortal would be something we'd have to work out using inductive logic, but if we knew that already, then this would be a deductive argument because it flows from the premises. What's good and bad about deductive arguments? So the good thing about them is if the premises are true, and if the structure of the argument is true, if the conclusion flows from the premises, then it must be true. There's no doubt about it. That's because it's based on logic. A deductive argument is sound as long as the premises are right and the conclusion does flow from the premises. So it means they can provide us with certain knowledge. However, it is often argued that deductive arguments don't tell us anything we didn't already know. They don't tell us new knowledge. They just help to clarify stuff that we already know. So, look at the examples we've got, like all cows are mammals, Tabitha is a cow, therefore Tabitha is a mammal. I mean, it's just telling us the obvious. Or, this is a square. Squares have four sides, therefore this has four sides. It's telling us something very banal. Banal meaning kind of nothingish, not very interesting. So they don't really tell us anything. They don't really give us a great deal of new knowledge in most cases. Okay, let's look at our last piece of key terminology. Okay, reductio ad absurdum. In philosophy, there are various types of argument, different ways of arguing. Reductio ad absurdum is a form of argument which seeks to demonstrate that a statement is true by showing that denying its truth can lead to a false, contradictory, or absurd meaning like silly, result. So kind of trying to say that this must be true, because if you deny that it's true, then you end up, your logical conclusion of denying this is true ends up with something silly that you definitely don't want to believe. Let's give some examples. The world is not flat, right? So that could be a statement. So how can we prove this? So we could do it like this. We could say, if the world was flat, people will fall off the edge of the world. This is ridiculous. We know people don't fall off the edge. Therefore, the Earth is not flat. So what I've done is I wanted to prove the Earth is not flat. So I look at the opposite. What would it be like if the world was flat? And I show that it leads to some ridiculous idea. It would lead to something that we all know doesn't happen. People would fall off the edge. We know they don't fall off the edge. Therefore, the Earth is not flat. So again, I've gone to the opposite of what I want to prove, and showed that if you believe the opposite, you're going to end up believing something silly. Okay, intelligence is not only caused by our genes, by our genetics. So this is I'm trying to say here that the intelligence that someone has is not completely because of their genes. I'm not trying to argue here that that doesn't play any role at all. I'm saying that is not the only thing that causes someone's intelligence. So here, I reverse it and say, okay, well, what's the absurd belief that you'd have to believe in if the opposite was true? Well, if intelligence was only caused by our genes, someone raised without human contact could still be a genius. So in other words, you could have someone, there are cases, if you're doing sociology, you might have seen this, there are cases of people who've been neglected or rejected by their family, and they've been raised in some way by animals. Now, the idea is ridiculous that someone could be like a genius at things if they weren't raised with no human contact, because they wouldn't have learned to speak, and there's so much stuff you need to learn to be a genius. So again, it leads to this ridiculous conclusion if we say that intelligence is only caused by genes, that education and being taught stuff plays no part in it. It leads to this ridiculous suggestion, and therefore we know it's not true, and therefore the statement I want to prove, intelligence is not caused solely by our genes, is correct. Okay, so that's a reductio ad absurdum, a form of argument. So here's the ontological argument then, and this is how we define it using our key terms. The ontological argument is a deductive argument, so that means it's based on logic. It's not based on using previous observations to prove something. It's based on logic, which obviously means that if the logic is correct and the premises are correct, then the argument is true. So if we criticize it, we've got to look at where's the logic gone wrong, or why are the premises wrong. It uses the technique of reductio ad absurdum. In other words, it tries to establish that God is true by arguing that if you believe that God's not true, it leads to some ridiculous conclusion. And we'll see why that is. It claims the existence of God can be known a priori. So it says you don't need any evidence to prove the existence of God. You can know just using reason. You don't need evidence at all, which is the thing that makes it so controversial. And it claims that statements like God exists, a statement like God exists is analytically true. It's true by definition that God exists. Again, that might seem very odd, but we'll see. Now, this is what makes it so unique, is that the main arguments for the existence of God, cosmological, teleological, they're inductive arguments because they start with some observation. Everything has a cause, and they go to God must exist, or they start with the observation there are things in the world that look like they're designed, therefore God must exist. They use inductive logic, whereas this uses deductive logic. So let's go into the argument. Here's St. Anselm, just a little bit about who he was and what he did. St. Anselm was a monk and a philosopher. He lived from 1033 to 1109. He was English, I believe. He came up with an analytic a priori deductive argument using reductio ad absurdum to prove the existence of God, and this is the ontological argument. It's written in his book called the Proslogion, which was written in 1078. And interestingly, it's written in the form of a prayer, which is based around a passage from the Bible, in Psalms in the Bible. It's quite a famous part of Psalms is this part where it says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God." So he addresses the fool. He writes a kind of prayer addressing this fool, saying why it's foolish to not believe in God. So that's the form of which it says. So, it's that part of the Bible is basically saying that only a fool would think there's no God. And he's trying to show why that's true, why you'd have to be a fool not to believe in God. Okay, I accidentally paused the playback there, so I don't know what I've missed out. So I'm going to go over some stuff again. Okay, Anselm starts with a definition of God, which makes sense because he's trying to prove that God exists by definition. So he starts with a definition. His definition is this: God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived. I've shortened that as STWNGCBT. Something than which nothing greater can be conceived. Oh. Now, why have I put T on the end? It's because conceived means thought. When we say conceived here, it means thought of. So I've put something than which nothing greater can be thought. Same thing. So he is basically saying God is the greatest thing you can think of. You can't think of anything better than God. There's nothing greater than God. And this does fit into generally what Christianity and other religions think about God. If you think about all the words we use to define God, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, there's lots of omni words because they're all. That means he's like loving completely. He's powerful to a complete degree. So God is supposed to be the maximum of all these great things. So God is supposed to be the thing, that is better and above all other things. There is a bit of a debate whether this is a good definition of God, but let's just take it for the time being that it is. And I do think it makes quite a lot of sense. Even people who are not religious, I think, can get behind this as a definition. They understand that when people talk about God, they mean this being that is better than, greater than everything else. So this is what he's saying. You can't think of anything better than God. He goes on to argue that everybody then has this idea of God in their heads. Whether they agree that this God really exists in real life, everybody agrees that this God exists in their head. We can all think of this being. We can all think of something than which nothing greater can be thought. Anselm then tries to, just to make it clear, he says, look, okay, but there's a difference, isn't there, between something that exists in the mind and something that exists both in the mind and in reality. So if you think about it, here's Van Gogh, right? He's a painter. Before he painted his sunflowers, he had the painting in his mind. And Van Gogh is not the example he gives because Van Gogh wasn't born at this time, but the painter is the example he gives. So Anselm says, look, a painter, before he's painted it, the painting exists, but only in his mind. It doesn't exist in reality. When he's painted it, exists both in his mind, because it was already existed there, and now it exists in reality too. So he just wants to make it clear. I know that seems very obvious, but he wants to make it clear there's a difference existing only in the mind and existing both in the mind and in reality. He then asks a question. He says, well, which is better? Something that exists just in your mind or something that exists in your mind and in reality? Now let's take money, because that's a good example. If I was to say to you, which is better, a bag of money that exists just in your mind or a bag of money that exists both in your mind and in reality. Now, everybody would say the money that exists in reality was better. But let's come back to God. What would be better? A perfect being like God that existed but only existed in your mind, or a perfect being like God who actually existed in reality as well as in your mind? Well, everyone would agree that God was better. It's better if it really exists. Hope we're following so far. Here we come to the, where we put everything together in the argument. So he says, we've already said, we know that God, something than which nothing greater can be thought, exists in our minds. Everyone knows that. However, but if God only existed in our minds, if he existed in our minds only, then we could think of something better. Because we've already said a God who actually exists in reality is better than a God who exists only in our minds. So I hope you're following so far. We know God exists in our minds, but from what we've already said about existence being better than non-existence, if God only existed in our minds, then we could think of something better. A God who actually exists in reality. But we've already said that God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. But that means that if God's something that greater than which nothing can be thought, then we shouldn't be able to think of something better than him. Because if we can think of something better than him, he's not something than which nothing greater can be thought, because we can think of something better. So if God only existed in our mind and didn't exist in reality, then we could imagine something better than God, a God that existed in reality. But the problem there is God is supposed to be this sort of being that we can't imagine anything better than him. So therefore, God must exist in reality and not just in our minds. So you need to think about this carefully, because this is a tricky argument. Think about how he's doing a reductio ad absurdum. He's saying, imagine that God didn't exist. Well, if God didn't exist, then what we would mean by that is that he would only exist in our mind, because we know he exists in our minds. So if God didn't exist, he would exist in our minds, but he wouldn't exist in reality. But we also know that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. So if he didn't exist, he exists in our mind, and he's the best thing we can think of. But actually, in that situation, there is something better that we could think of. We could think of a God that really existed in reality. So this leads us into an absurd situation. If God doesn't exist, according to the logic here, if God doesn't exist, then he both is the being than that which we can think of nothing better, but also we can think of something better. Well, that can't be. Logically, that can't be. God can't be the best thing we can think of if we can think of something better. So this is where Anselm is saying it leads to a problem. Here's the argument kind of bullet pointed from his description of it in the Proslogion. So this is in chapter 2, and I should say we're going to look at another form of the argument later, but we're going to take it one step at a time, because he gives two forms of the argument in the book. So this is from chapter 2. So let's just go through the bullet points. God is the greatest thing that can be thought of. God may exist in the mind only, or in both the mind and reality. So he could just be in our minds. Everyone agrees that we could think of him, but he could be in reality too. Something that exists in reality and in the mind is greater than something that exists in the mind alone. It's better for something to exist in reality than just as a thought in our heads. Therefore, if God only existed in our minds, we could think of a greater being, and that would be one that existed in reality. So if God didn't exist in reality, if he was only in our minds, we could think of something better. We could think of one that existed in our minds and in reality. However, God is by definition the greatest thing we can think of. There cannot be something greater than God. So it leads to this situation that can't be true. God can't be the greatest thing we can think of if we can think of something greater than God. Therefore, God must exist in reality. If he exists in reality, then it's true to say that we can't think of something better because a really existing God is the greatest thing you can think of. So that is Anselm's argument. That is why he thinks God must exist by definition. Now, the most important thing at the moment is that you understand the logic of his argument. And I think that if you're finding it tricky to follow, and it is quite tricky because it's kind of one of those things that makes your head turn inside out a bit. If you're finding it tricky to follow, watch back those sections of the video again and just go over it again in your mind. Look through the bullet points, see if you can understand how the logic takes him through. What I don't really want you to do is to try and criticize him at this point unless you think you completely understand what he's saying. Because I think what gets people into difficulty with Anselm's argument is that they immediately think he's wrong, and then they start to try and work out why he's wrong now. What you need to do is make sure that you understand why he believes what he believes. You need to understand his argument before you start to chip away at why it's not a good argument. Because the temptation is just to say this is ridiculous and throw it out the window, but you need to understand it. And it's only really by understanding that you can understand why he's probably wrong. So take yourself through the argument slowly. It's the bit about existing in our minds and existing in reality, and then the way he uses reductio ad absurdum, which is the tough thing to understand. Okay, this is the last thing. So what I want you to do, as well as annotating your notes, is to write it out in your own words, the argument, and do it very, like I've done it on bullet points there. Do it like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. So start with the definition. God can be defined as something than which nothing greater can be conceived, or something than which nothing greater can be thought, or even if put it more into sort of words you would use naturally, like God can be defined as a thing which is it's impossible to think of anything better than. And then slowly go through the logic. Then you'd go to. Anselm also says that something can exist just in our minds, in our imagination, or it can exist both in our minds and in real life. Then you go to 3. Existing in our minds and real life is greater than just existing in our minds. Then you can go to 4, which would be let's look at what would happen then if those things are true. Let's look what would happen if God didn't exist. If God didn't exist, then we could imagine something better, a God who existed in real life. And then you go to your next one. However, this leads to a problem, because that would mean that God was the greatest thing we can think of, but we could also think of something greater than God. And that can't be true. Those two things together can't be true. So therefore, the only way to resolve that problem is to say, well, actually, God must exist. So see if you can take it through points 1, 2, 3, however many points you think you need before you get to that conclusion. And like I say, we will look at criticisms later. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If it's really confusing, just let it settle for a while, come back to it and watch it again. Try and go over it a few times. This is where not being in school is tough, because we would go sit and talk about this for quite a while to try and get our heads around it. But if you're finding it really tough, do let me know. Do send me a message to say, I just don't get this at all. And we'll try and see what we can do about it. Okay, thank you.